You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hey everyone, Bob Keane here, editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology. Actually, outgoing editor Jeff Kane is the incoming editor, so you'll be able to listen to him on these podcasts later on. Today we're going to talk about a wicked cool paper. It's a paper that takes place in a place that hardly gets published on Fire Ecology journals. The title of this paper is Fire History and Tree Invasion in an Ozark Glade, Barrens, and Woodland Complex. Today we have Will and Theo here to talk about the paper. Will, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. So my name is Will Flatley. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Central Arkansas, and I'm a biogeographer, forest ecologist, fire ecologist, and dendrochronologist. I use tree rings as one of my research tools.
Well, thanks for joining us, Will. How about you, Theo?
Hi, I'm Theo Witsell. I'm the Chief Conservation Officer for the Southeastern Grasslands Institute at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. This work here began when I was in another job. I was the Chief of Research and Ecologist for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission.
Welcome, Theo. You too. Thanks for giving your time. Will, tell us about this really interesting paper.
It's a 200-year history of a glade and barren landscape in the Ozarks, and it really lays out the role of frequent fire in maintaining these habitats in the past. And so the interest in working in these glades and barrens habitats is that they provide habitat for a range of rare and threatened species in the Ozark landscape, and then also really across the broader southeastern United States. So there's important habitat. You can think of them essentially as islands of treeless or semi-treeless xeric grassland habitats within the broader landscape of oak, hickory, pine forest in the Ozarks. The important habitats, however, we know that glades and barrens are declining due to woody invasion, possibly due to 20th century fire suppression, but we really haven't had a direct link between the removal of fire and tree invasion of these glades. Our goal in this paper was to use fire-scarred shortleaf pines and then tree cores from plots within these glade habitats to characterize the fire history and then also the history of invasion at this one site and link the two together. So we're able to develop 300-year history of frequent fire at the site, primarily dormant season fires, up until the 1930s when fire essentially stops at the site. And then with the tree age structure from these plots within the glades, we were able to show that woody establishment pulses initiated in the decades immediately following fire suppression. So linking those two together, the cessation of fire and then the invasion and change in these glade habitats. So the paper provides strong evidence showing that fire maintained the glades and barrens habitats, preventing trees from establishing. And then looking forward, the paper also provides guidance for managers in terms of the frequency and seasonality of prescribed burns that they can use in the future to restore and maintain glades in the Ozark region.
Yeah, that's quite an impressive fire record. It was a study that really quantified the fire in this particular area. Theo, can you tell us what was the impetus for the study? Why did you do it?
Yeah, so we know that these are special habitats, like Will mentioned. So they're grasslands. The glades and barrens are grasslands. He mentioned they were xeric. They're really hydroxeric in some cases, where they're wet part of the year in the winter and spring and become extremely xeric in the summertime. They're essentially little micro desert grasslands, arid grasslands within this woodland matrix. You never get just the glade. You get the glade, which is sort of an edaphic community with bedrock very close to the surface, surrounded by a deeper soil prairie-like grassland, often embedded within it as well, where you have deeper soil pockets, and that's the barrens. And then they're always in conjunction with a historically open woodland. We've seen biodiversity collapse in these ecosystems as tree encroachment has happened following the cessation of fire. So that seems to be the big problem. And then the solution is intervention through restoration and management. And that includes typically woody plant removal. Eastern red cedar is one of the biggest invaders in this ecosystem. And then reintroduction of fire. But the devil's in the details. So managers are trying to understand how often fire should happen, how intense should that fire be, and what season did the fire occur in historically that the ecosystem is best adapted to respond positively. So this study gets at those things. We're trying to figure out what the fire frequency interval was historically, and then also the seasonality. And hopefully that will inform land managers working today who are trying to do the right thing. Fire is such a useful tool. It can be very beneficial to these ecosystems, but it can also be deleterious. So depending when and how it's applied. That's why we did the study.
Well, so Will, you already gave us a taste of the methods and the results, but I wonder if you would like to add anything more. What was special about these methods? And just give us a little sneak peek about the results.
One of the things that makes this study unique is, I mentioned before, the combination of both fire history and looking at the timing of tree invasion in the glades. And there have been not many, but one or two studies reconstructing fire history in and around glades in the past. And then there have been studies looking at, we know that these glades are being invaded over the last 50, 100 years through examinations of aerial photography, and also some studies that have looked at the age structure of trees invading or the timing invasion, but not really combining the two together. So that was an important piece. This landscape where we had fire history, we could examine the timing of invasion and see if those both align to really provide a stronger link between this change in the fire regime and the actual glade invasion.
Yeah, great. So, Theo, what do you think the management implications are of this study?
The big controversial things right now in this part of the world in fire management is when to burn and what exactly does the dormant season mean, right? So that term has been used as it applies to forestry or to trees, right? So when the deciduous trees have their leaves off, that's often considered the dormant season by most land managers. Of course, we have green up starting in the herbaceous layer in these grasslands and open woodlands as early as February. So there's this period between the end of the hard freeze when the buds are starting to swell on these herbaceous plants, and some point, sometimes in mid, even late April, when the tree canopy fully leaves out. And that is part of the growing season for the herbaceous flora. These are ecosystems without a lot of tree diversity. They're pretty dry. You might have 3 or 4 species of tree in the canopy in a site, maybe a few more, but you might have several hundred species of herbaceous plants on the ground. That's really the diversity contributing strata in this ecosystem. So there's been a lot of concern and evidence that burning in the springtime after those plants have greened up is causing damage to the ecosystem and wildlife. What we're seeing is there's a lot of evidence for when the fires occurred historically is in that dormant season of tree. And we look at the dormant season a little differently. It would actually extend even into the late growing season in a drought year. So the tree rings become tight. And when these trees start to shut down metabolically because of drought stress, that is the time when lightning fires were often happening on the ground. So we're trying to draw some correlations of when fires happened historically and what does that do to the flora of these ecosystems and the animals too, really. I think that's a lot of the management implication. That's the question that land managers are looking to answer. Also, the fire frequency. So how often should we be applying fire? Is it every other year? Is it every year? Is it every 5-6 years? Needing guidance to know what the system evolved with and what we can maybe do to replicate those ecosystem processes that are no longer functioning. That's the implications.
That's the real value of this paper, is that it really does give insight into those wonderful management locations you just mentioned, Theo. Can you give us a sneak peek of the results?
The results from the study, first starting with the fire history, we were able to reconstruct about 250 years of fire history at the site. We found that over that entire record, 2.6-year composite mean fire interval up until the period of fire protection in the 1930s. So prior to that, going back into the early 1700s, we had fire scars, really frequent fire, short fire intervals at the site. The vast majority of fires occurred in the dormant season, meaning that the scars were recorded in the rings between 1 year's growth and the start of the next year's growth. So sometime maybe between October and March, pretty wide potential range there. And we did find some difference in fire frequency between, we looked at both the Native American period up until 1830, and then from 1830 until 1930, the period of fire suppression, which we termed the Euro-American period, and saw slightly longer fire return intervals during that early period of Native American land use, but still relatively frequent fires, about an 8-year composite mean fire interval during that earlier period. And then from the tree establishment, again, these pulses of establishment in the 1930s and 1940s is when they initiated following the decline of fire at the site, establishment of eastern red cedar and chinkapin oak in particular, and then kind of looking at the dynamics of that tree establishment, we found that the areas that were invaded last on the site were areas that had higher insulation values, so sort of south-facing slopes, drier slopes, which makes sense that those portions of the landscape might resist that invasion longer than wetter sites that were more quickly invaded by trees.
Last question is, Theo, would you like to recognize any co-authors or funding agencies before we sign off?
Absolutely. We have two co-authors that could not be on the podcast, and that's Lillian Bragg and Alexander Russell. Thanks to them, and thanks to the University of Central Arkansas Department of Geography, where Will works, and the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission, where I used to work, and they also provided the funding for the study, and the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, where I work now, because I did some of the writing on the clock for them. So those are the funding agencies, so thanks for the support.
Well, I want to thank both of you for coming on and sharing your time today. Really appreciate it. For those listeners out there, if this paper really turns you on and you want to know more about fire in the Ozarks, you can download it for free. That's correct, because Will and his crew have already paid the freight for you to go ahead and download the paper. So because Fire Ecology is an open source journal, you get the paper for free. So please download it. And if you have time, come and join us for the next Fire Ecology Chats.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FireEcology.org.